Well, welcome back to Mind Inclined. Today we're doing an interview with one of my favorite people and colleagues, somebody I've had the pleasure of working with for a long time. He's moved on to another job, and so have I, but we stay in touch. This is Dr. Scott Billingsley. He is a longtime historian. We worked together at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and now he is the provost at University of Alaska Southeast. So we haven't seen each other as much as we would like, but I'm seeing him today, and I'm really eager to talk with him about a subject that I've heard him speak on before. He is a historian, as I said, particularly in American history, but he specializes in religious history. And as we're thinking about America 250 these days, I'm thinking a lot about some of the various subjects related to colonial America, one of which is Deism, which was a religious movement that involved a lot of the founders. And Scott knows much more about that subject than I do. So, welcome, Scott. Delighted to have you on the program.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's certainly good to see you again, and I appreciate you inviting me on your program. I follow your newsletter and am excited to be here.
Okay, terrific. Well, let's get started with the basics. What exactly is deism?
It is essentially a belief in a rational creator who doesn't really intervene in the world. There's no miracles, there's no supernatural revelation, there's no real need for churches and clergy. The metaphor that is often used is that it's a watchmaker who created a watch, wound it up, and then step back and just kind of let it go. Now, I do want to emphasize that deism is not the same as atheism. Deists believe in a God, and that can vary in terms of, what that may or may not look like. And so it's not certainly not the same thing as atheism, but it's also distinct from Orthodox Christianity, where deists typically reject Scripture as divinely inspired. They do not necessarily reject all the teachings in the traditional Bible, but it's one of those belief systems that has a lot of latitude. There's a wide spectrum of deistic belief, or there was in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so deism was important, not really so much as a religious movement, so to say, but how it affected thought, particularly around the framing of the Constitution and the founding of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries.
I'm really eager to get to that part, but let me get a little bit more historical background. You said 18th and 19th century. How far back does deism go, and how did it emerge? Where did it come from?
So you could really probably trace it back to the 17th century. A guy named Edward Herbert of England is kind of known as the father of deism. And he didn't really create this religion or anything like that. He didn't come up with a really strict belief system that people followed, but he essentially created the structure that later writers and thinkers and philosophers would build upon in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And so he wrote a book in the 1620s, and that kind of laid out the sort of five common notions of deism. That God exists, that worship is owed to that creator, that virtue is important in the life of people everywhere, that repentance matters, and that there's an afterlife. And it basically is this rational religion that is stripped of all dogma. And, it could apply to any religion, not just Christianity. And so this idea that, there were, these kind of, sort of five principles that any religion, if you strip all of the stories and the miracles and the supernatural things off of it, really kind of came down to those things. And so then as you add on, the English Enlightenment and the works of John Locke and Isaac Newton, all of those things are kind of built on that foundation that Edward Herbert laid in the early 17th century.
So interesting. And particularly interesting to me is as you're rattling off those five tenets, they sound so familiar to me because, as you know, I'm a scholar of Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin echoed those almost word for word when he wrote about his belief system. So obviously, I know a bit about Franklin, but I also know he was not the only founder to dabble in deism. And we call him a founder, but he was dabbling in deism way back in his youth, long before he was hanging out with Jefferson. So tell me a little bit about some of the founders and which ones were considered themselves deists. I know Franklin dabbled in it for a while and then gave up on it. There's a wonderful story he tells in his autobiography that he recognized some of the shortcomings of his fellow deists and even some of his own shortcomings and said, I began to suspect that this doctrine, though it might be true, was not very useful. So he recognized that it didn't necessarily result in virtuous behavior. But aside from Franklin, who were some of the other deists whom we would recognize as being some of our founders and leaders in colonial America?
I mean, there were many, and I would like to emphasize that they were not a monolith in how they believed or what they believed. Even those who were deists, they occupied this wide spectrum from kind of mild orthodoxy to nearly secular rationalism. But you look at Benjamin Franklin, you look at George Washington, you look at Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Those were probably the most famous of the founders who expressed or indicated some sort of deism. Benjamin Franklin was interesting because he was pretty coy in expressing his beliefs. He had a correspondence with his good friend Ezra Stiles right at the end of his life when he was in his 80s. Ezra Stiles was like, okay, what do you actually believe? And Benjamin Franklin responded with, well, nobody's really asked me about this. But he kind of lays out that he acknowledged a creator God, that he wrote about a powerful goodness. But yeah, he skipped church. He wasn't all that comfortable with organized religion all the time. Although he was very fond of George Whitefield, who was, one of the, kind of key promoters of the First Great Awakening in the 18th century, and I actually gave to his ministry. But he really didn't buy into the idea that you have to go to church, that you have to believe in all the miracles and all of those things in order to, be a good person. Uh, George Washington was also pretty veiled or cryptic in the way he talked about God. He would use, terms like providence or the grand architect. But he very seldom, if ever, really, talked about, God in a traditional sense. He didn't talk about, Jesus. He would go to church. I mean, he was an Anglican in the sense that, he was of the, aristocracy, and that's what, aristocrats, Virginia aristocrats did. They went to church. But, he was noted because he would not kneel to pray. He stood. And so he didn't really fit that mold of, this evangelical Christian or anything like that. Thomas Jefferson, probably one of the more interesting ones of the group. He, in some ways, was kind of all over the map with his personal beliefs. But what he is probably most famous for in this regard, as far as deism goes, is he kind of created his own Bible. I mean, he literally took a knife and cut out portions of the Bible that had anything to do with supernatural events, with miracles, with the virgin birth, with the resurrection of Jesus. And he actually did this on a couple of different occasions. The first edition of this we don't really have a copy of, but the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth was sort of his version of the Bible. And he emphasized things like the Sermon on the Mount, but he really de-emphasized all of the miracles and the supernatural things that most Christians believed. James Madison argued basically that religion was corrupted by government, and kind of vice versa. That the government, should not only not be involved in religion, but religion shouldn't be involved in government. And they were both better off when they were separated. Madison was fairly clear with his views, but he was not as strident about them as, say, Thomas Jefferson, and he tended to be a little more diplomatic in the way he presented those views.
What do you think it was about deism that attracted all of these figures? I'm sure that the Enlightenment had something to do with it, but what else would you say was in play that would attract all of these people we recognize as some of the greatest Americans, the founders of our country, and so many of them were attracted to deism at a time when Orthodox Christianity had a pretty good hold on America, and yet they were deviating from that in some ways. As you said, Washington was able to balance on some level going to Anglican Episcopal services, but also being a deist. And as you mentioned, Franklin was really never much for organized religion, even though he thought that it generally did good. What do you think it was about deism that attracted all of these intellectuals?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just kind of the intellectual environment of the time. I think the Enlightenment had a big influence on how they were thinking about these things. And while Edward Herbert's name probably was not well known by the late 1700s, those ideas had sort of integrated themselves into intellectual thought, so that those folks who were educated had read those ideas in a lot of different places, and they were just kind of swimming in that water. They were sort of surrounded by all of these ideas, and they kind of came to similar conclusions, although not exactly the same conclusions, sort of independently of each other. And it mattered also in the political sense, because there were these ideas that were floating around that maybe you don't need a king in order to have a successful nation. And this idea that there's this creator way out there. He made this watch, he wound it up, he stepped back and let it run. It mattered constitutionally because you have a God that doesn't take sides. They're not devoted to any particular church. They're not devoted to any particular dogma. And so you couldn't use religion in order to claim that political authority. When you look at the Constitution, religion is left out of it almost entirely in the original document. There's kind of one sort of vague reference and one a little more explicit. There's a reference in the Constitution that allows for affirming an oath instead of swearing an oath, and this was kind of a nod to the Quakers. They had some religious sensibilities about swearing oaths. But probably more explicitly was that there was no religious test for office. And this was pretty radical for its time. Most governments said, okay, you've got to pass this religious test if we're going to let you be a political leader. And the Constitution said very explicitly, no, you don't really have to do that. And then when you look at the amendments, I mean, the very first amendment is the no establishment clause, the free exercise of religion. And this was both a freedom of religion and a freedom from religion. The founders, particularly Madison, wanted to keep those two things separate in order to protect both government and religion. And so they really felt like that, having these things separated was going to matter in terms of establishing the framework for this new nation, that they didn't really know if it was going to last or not. I mean, this really was a grand experiment. And so they were setting these things up in hopes that it would provide a structure for a lasting nation.
Boy, hearing you talk, I just think about how relevant all of this still is in terms of separation of church and state and so on. And I think my next question also points to the relevance of what you're discussing, Scott. How did the Orthodox traditional Christians in the other denominations, the Catholics and the Anglicans and so on, how do they respond to deism? Because I could see where it could be pretty controversial when they're trying to pull
Yeah.
out the miracles and Jefferson's clipping out the parts he doesn't like. And where did the deists stand in terms of the religious public opinion?
Yeah. So for the most part, especially in the late 18th century, they just kind of kept it to themselves. They didn't really advertise this stuff. These were the things that they thought about in their libraries at their homes. But in the 1790s, mid 1790s, Thomas Paine wrote a book that kind of outed all of that, and the Age of Reason. And I think you interviewed, was it Scott Cleary
Yeah.
recently to talk about Thomas Paine? Yeah. And so he essentially does what the founders, were too, they were too politic to do. He attacks Christianity directly. He basically calls the Bible human fabrication. Now, you also have to understand the context in which he wrote this. He was in France, 1790s, French Revolution was going on. He was arrested. He thought he was going to be, guillotined. And he really kind of said, okay, look what's happening in France here. They have rejected Orthodox Christianity altogether, but they also went to atheism. And he didn't think either of those two options were very good. And so he really promotes this idea of deism, and just kind of attacks traditional Christianity in a way that did not set well with people. And so that really kind of, opened the floodgates for people to start criticizing, this thought, this deism. Thomas Paine, incidentally, was kind of ostracized, after he came back. I mean, he was eventually released from prison and came back to the United States, and basically died with almost no friends. But it also allowed, so like for instance, in the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams really kind of launched the first, true sort of political campaigns, essentially running for president, Jefferson was attacked as an atheist because of his deistic beliefs. And even though Jefferson was not an atheist, that was sort of how it was framed. And so you've got that kind of backlash there, but you also have, really starting in the 1790s and running through the 1840s, the Second Great Awakening. And so there's this religious revival that is all about this sense of community. And it was, a very emotional sort of religious revival. And so all of the things that deism didn't provide, church attendance and that sense of community and really kind of a sense of hope. The Second Great Awakening was providing that. And so you see the rise of this religious revival in the early 19th century, not so much in response to deism, but sort of juxtaposed against it, as it was coming under attack around the turn of the 19th century.
Fascinating. What do you see as the impact of deism long term, and why don't we hear much about it today? I mean, I suspect there probably are deists out there somewhere, but when I think of it, I think of the 18th century. So it's had a legacy through the Constitution, obviously, and through the founders and their ideas and their impact. But why don't we hear much about deism today?
I mean, I think once that, kind of thought process sort of, ran its course in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, not many people were talking about it, but the ideas really did persist. I mean, you see it in our political system, you see it in the way that that the Constitution was established, that the government was set up. You still had established religion, state-supported religion at the state level until the 1830s. But after that, you don't even have that. And so you see that kind of in the political system there. But you also see that English Enlightenment persist even in religious thought. So when you look at some of the key proponents of the Second Great Awakening, people like Alexander. Um, um, Oh, I'm blanking on Alexander Campbell. I'm sorry. He was very much a rationalist thinker in his religious views. And he is one who really kind of established what became the Disciples of Christ, the independent Christian churches, the churches of Christ in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. But his thought process, his approach to scripture even was very much influenced by this enlightened rationalism that had influenced the founders and the writing of the Constitution and all of that. In terms of modern day, I think a parallel might be the folks who are spiritual but not religious. I think they're called the nuns right now. They're just religiously unaffiliated. They make up maybe 25-30% of the American population. And so while they have these spiritual views and they have these belief systems, they're not really tied to any particular denomination. They're not tied to any particular, dogma in the same way that you might be as a Catholic or a Methodist or a Baptist or a Presbyterian. And so even though they're not really deists per se, there's still that idea that, they can kind of have their own way of thinking and their that sort of shapes their worldview and also shapes their behavior and their attitudes and how they treat people in the world. And that really was kind of what a lot of these deists were doing in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Oh, that's a great parallel. I had not thought about that, but I see a lot of similarities there in terms of trying to be released from dogma. I think about what Franklin wrote that he finally decided he would try to give a chance to one of these Presbyterian ministers. And after a while, he said he went for 4 or 5 times and decided that this guy wasn't trying to make them better people. He was trying to make them better Presbyterians. And
Yeah.
Franklin really had no patience for all of that concentration on
Right.
dogma. And I gathered that some of his fellow founders and a lot of people today, I didn't realize it was 25%. That's a pretty remarkable figure. And I think it says something to us about, I mean, whether you believe we should have a lot of dogma or not, I'm not going to take a position on that, but it does say something to us about what people's desires are and where they find themselves attracted. And I've sensed that from a lot of people around me that there is a longing for a spiritual life that doesn't always align with a particular dogma or Orthodox Christianity or even a particular sect.
Mhm. Yeah, and that also kind of feeds into this idea that people do kind of they want some structure, they want some guidance, and they want a sense of hope. And so whether that comes in the form of, a non-religion religion or in the form of a, very prescriptive, liturgical style, it really varies from person to person. Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, Scott. Thank you for illuminating this aspect of colonial America. Appreciate your being with us, and I'd love to have you come back and talk about the Great Awakening. I know that's one of your areas of specialization. You've been working on a biography of Barton Stone. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Stone and where he fits in the religious history of the United States?
Yeah, so he was also one of these kind of key leaders in the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. And he and Alexander Campbell really kind of co-founded this movement that led to the establishment of the Disciples of Christ, Christian churches, churches of Christ. But they were both very non-denominational in their way of thinking. Alexander Campbell has gotten a little more publicity. A good friend of mine, Doug Foster, published a biography of him a couple of years ago. But Barton Stone has received less attention. And so at some point when I go back to the faculty ranks and I have time to sit and think and study like that, and I'm not worried about accreditation and hiring deans and those sorts of things, I'll get back to that project. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish you luck with that. Well, thanks for the time. And for the rest of you, this is part of our series that we're doing as we celebrate America 250. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year in 2026. And here at Mind and Klein, we're running a series of interviews and essays and podcasts, and we're going to be on site. So some of the places you can think about visiting us are Philadelphia. We're going to be doing a trip to Philadelphia next month. That one's full, but we're thinking of doing another one in the summer or the fall. So we'd love to have you join us. And we also are going to do a trip to Paris, where we will retrace the steps of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson during the years of the American Revolution and afterwards. So if you want to learn about any of those things or check out our free podcasts and essays, I encourage you to join us at mindinclined.org.